Number 8. Hinrich BST. Hinrich BST was a German flying ace who served valiantly in the Luftwaffe during World War II. While fighting on the Eastern Front for the first 2 years of his career, he shot down at least 50 enemy aircraft. Most German aces fought exclusively against Soviet soldiers, and those who saw battle on the Western Front had a relatively short average lifespan compared to those battling in the East. BST was one of those few exceptions. After getting moved over to the West, he was one of just a few German pilots who quickly racked up kills. Throughout the summer of 1942 alone, he garnered 73 victories in the Mediterranean. 14 of the planes he shot down were P-38 Lightnings, which were a formidable and often deadly force when up against German pilots. Toward the end of 1944, BST was only 2 kills away from the 100 mark. The day before Christmas Eve, he and several other pilots took off on a mission to intercept a raid in Bonn, Germany. He shot down an American P-47 Thunderbolt. This marked what would have been his 99th and final kill. BST mysteriously vanished after that and remained missing for the next 24 years. In 1968, his Messerschmitt aircraft was discovered buried in soft mud in a wooded part of Germany. His remains were still inside the cockpit, and his wedding ring was even found tucked inside his glove, finally solving the mystery of his tragic fate. He was buried in Germany after being officially identified not long after. Number 7. Louise Petrowitz. In what would eventually become one of Long Island's longest-running missing persons cases, 38-year-old Louise Petrowitz took all of the money out of her bank account and vanished in October 1966. At the same time, she was unhappy in her marriage and was last seen driving away from her family's farm in Sagaponack with her boyfriend and the man she was having an affair with, a married police officer named William P. Boken. At the time, Louise had a young daughter, Sandy, who knew her mom would never abandon her by choice. But no remains were ever found, no arrests were made, and while rumors occasionally circulated, Louise's disappearance was eventually forgotten. In 2017, over 50 years after Louise went missing, the Suffolk Times published an extensive report on her case, sparking a renewed interest among the public and catching law enforcement's attention. Detectives reopened the case, and in early 2018, they located Louise's skeletal remains in the basement of a property in the town of Southold. The home was once owned by Boken, Louise's affair partner. The discovery was made thanks to a tip from Boken's wife, who told authorities that a body was buried somewhere beneath the house shortly after Louise's disappearance. Without naming names, a law enforcement agent said that sometimes witnesses come forward years or even decades after a crime is committed, sometimes out of guilt and sometimes because they finally feel safe sharing the information they know. Boken died in 1982, and the house was sold several years before that. His wife and children had no contact with him during the last 14 years of his life, and he was buried in a pauper's grave after no one claimed his body. Police had already searched the basement on a previous occasion and found nothing of importance, but they had better luck this time after new information prompted them to search a different area of the space. After breaking through the concrete floor and digging about 7 feet, investigators discovered Louise's skeleton. DNA testing confirmed the identity of the body, confirming Sandy's suspicion that her mom never chose to leave her on purpose. Number 6. Isossu Wano. It's extremely rare for a missing soldier to somehow turn up alive years after a war, let alone decades. But this was actually the case for a man named Isossu Wano, one of the roughly 400 Japanese servicemen who lived in the Soviet Union after World War II. In almost every one of those cases, those who didn't make it back home eventually died in forced labor camps. When Wano failed to come back to Japan after his last confirmed sighting in the USSR's Sakhalin Island in 1958, his family just assumed he died. In 2000, Wano was declared legally dead. They were shocked to find out 5 years later that he was alive and well, living in Ukraine, where he raised a family of his own. It's unclear how Wano ended up settling down in Ukraine, and he declined to go into too many details, but he did say that his reasons for not returning to Japan had something to do with the former Soviet regime. In other words, Soviet officials probably refused to let him leave the country. The news that Wano was alive came after he reached out to the Japanese embassy in Ukraine to see if it was possible for him to return to his homeland. A crew of Japanese workers were dispatched to Ukraine, where, to everyone's shock, they confirmed Wano was who he claimed to be. In 2006, he visited Japan and reunited with his two sisters for the first time since 1943. It was his first time speaking Japanese in about 60 years. He stayed there for 10 days as a visiting tourist who was now officially a Ukrainian citizen. Little is known about what's been going on in Wano's life after the tearful family reunion, but he reportedly passed away back in 2013, around the age of 90. Number 5. Lawrence E. Dixon. During World War II, 27 members of a unit consisting of highly skilled Black American pilots called the Tuskegee Airmen went missing in action. One of them was a 24-year-old captain named Lawrence E. Dixon, who vanished while escorting a reconnaissance plane the day before Christmas Eve back in 1944. About an hour after Dixon took off the runway and started heading for Prague from his base in southern Italy, he made a call on the radio and said he was having engine trouble. One of his wingmen, Lieutenant Robert L. Martin, later told the Washington Post that Dixon had to turn the plane back toward base. He crashed while searching for a spot to land or bail, and his fellow crew members lost sight of him in the process. The young pilot never made it home from his mission. When months passed without any word from her husband, Dixon's wife Phyllis wrote to the War Department in hopes of finding him. She waited patiently in hopes that he would be found, but it never happened. Finally, in 2018, 73 years after Dixon's disappearance, the U.S. Defense POW MIA accounting agency confirmed that human remains were located at a crash site in Austria, and they belonged to Dixon. The crash site was discovered by DPAA analyst Joshua Frank based on records describing a downed aircraft near the country's border with Germany. During a visit to the site, Frank confirmed that the aircraft was the same type Dixon was flying, a P-51 nicknamed Pagan. It was inside a crater and covered by moss. Frank said that the site was still littered with ash, and the surrounding trees had bore marks and scars from when the plane crashed and erupted into flames. Dixon's remains were recovered from the wreck, making him the first Tuskegee Airman to be positively identified, and most likely the first to be found since the war ended. Dixon's 76-year-old daughter Marla Andrews was overwhelmed by the news. At her request, her father's remains were transported home and buried at Arlington National Cemetery. How would you react if a loved one you thought was gone forever was miraculously found? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the video. At number 4, Alfred Swinko. In 1967, a 54-year-old British miner named Alfred Swinko mysteriously vanished into thin air after a night out drinking at a pub in the village of Pinxton. The last known sighting of him happened outside the bar that night. He said he was going to use the restroom and never came back, leaving his 6 children and his family shocked and speechless. 56 years later, in 2023, human remains were found in a field in Nottinghamshire. After hearing a description of the skeleton's size and clothes, Swinko's 60-year-old grandson, Russell Lowbridge, contacted law enforcement with his suspicion that the remains belonged to his grandfather. Lowbridge's hunch was correct. The skeleton was of Alfred Swinko. But this only solved one piece of the puzzle. Based on the injuries to his remains, a medical examiner concluded that Swinko was murdered. The next question for investigators was why someone killed the miner, and if possible, who was responsible. While it's doubtful that the killer is still alive, having some long overdue answers could help the family finally put the matter to rest. After Swinko's remains were positively identified, Lowbridge told the press that his grandfather's disappearance tormented his uncle Gary, who was with Swinko the night he went missing. Gary unfortunately died in 2012, never knowing what happened to his father. For now, authorities hope that anyone who knew Swinko or has information comes forward. Any extra hint could be what it takes to help crack the case. At number 3, Mateo Sabog. U.S. Army Master Sergeant Mateo Sabog went missing while serving in Vietnam back in 1970. He was in the armed forces for 24 years and was about to go home to the U.S. when he vanished. Unsure of whether he made it back to the U.S. or if he went missing overseas, the Army listed Sabog as a deserter. While his family was just as confused as everyone else regarding his sudden disappearance, they knew that he wouldn't have abandoned his military duties after almost a quarter-century of service. They campaigned for a change on his record, and the Army later changed Sabog's status from AWOL to dead. His name was then put on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And in 1995, Vietnam returned human remains to the U.S. that its government said belonged to Sabog. The next year, in 1996, 26 years after he went missing, a disheveled and disoriented elderly man claiming to be Sabog applied for Social Security benefits at a government office in Chattanooga. A representative from the agency told the man that Sabog was actually dead, but he didn't believe it. He didn't have any identifying documents to back up his claim. Instead, he referred the representative to his brother in Hawaii, who he said could confirm who he was. The military finally identified him through fingerprints, and investigators had no clue how and why Sabog stayed under radar for so many years. They were hesitant to relabel Sabog as a deserter and told the press that the military planned to treat him with respect as they worked to answer these questions surrounding his reappearance. Since Sabog was never properly discharged, the Army had to follow the necessary protocols. They returned him to active duty so they could start the process of formally discharging him. Authorities determined that Sabog was taken in by a family in California after his return to the States. He spent at least 10 years living in Rossville, Georgia, under the name Bobby Fernandez. He worked as a live-in caregiver for an elderly woman. In 1993, 3 years before he went to the Social Security Administration and applied for benefits, and the same year his name was added to the Veterans Memorial, he went to his local police with concerns that he was labeled an AWOL soldier. The police reportedly looked into the matter and told Sabog that it wasn't possible for him to be who he said he was, since that person was listed as dead. Sabog was eventually given an honorable discharge from the Army. He spent his last few years living in Hawaii near his family, where he supported himself with a military pension until his death in 2007. Number 2. Fishermen find Castaway Uncle. While on a fishing trip in the Pacific Ocean back in 2011, 2 men from Kiribati had their navigation system break down. 53-year-old Uwain Baranabwe and 26-year-old Temei Tontake drifted for about 33 days before finally washing ashore on a remote atoll called Namdrik in the Marshall Islands. The men were grateful to have found dry land, but they were shocked to cross paths with descendants of their uncle, Bairo Tontake, who also went missing during a fishing trip about 60 years earlier during the 1950s. Bairo was presumed dead, but it turned out he had come ashore in the same island his nephews arrived at decades later. Stranded 350 miles from Kiribati with no way of getting home, Bairo made a new life for himself on Namdrik, where he was welcomed with open arms into the community. While his loved ones thought he was dead, he married a local woman, raised a family, and lived the rest of his days on the island. By the time the young men landed on Namdrik, their uncle had already passed away. When they arrived, a local took them to the only person on the island who still spoke their language, a living descendant of Bairo. The long-running family mystery was finally put to rest, bringing renewed hope to others whose family members never came back from being out at sea, which apparently happens on a regular basis there. Number 1. Arthur David Melvin. Less than 15 years after moving to Calgary, Alberta from Scotland in the early 20th century, Arthur Davidson Melvin volunteered to serve in World War I with the 56th Infantry Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He went to Europe in 1916 and eventually transferred to the 31st Infantry Battalion. Melvin went missing in April 1917 at 29 years old while his unit fought to hold the French village of Thélus during the Battle of Arras. He was later presumed dead, but the whereabouts of his body remained a mystery until a century later. In 2019, an international collective called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission contacted Canadian officials with the possible location of Melvin's grave at the Bois Carré British Cemetery in Tellu. Experts positively confirmed the identity of the remains in 2021, marking one less among the 11,000 missing soldiers listed on the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France. Thanks for watching. Which of these cases did you find the most interesting? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. Bye for now.